Things were happening in the region of Caesarea Philippi. It was a great moment for the disciples. They were seeing successes in the mission field. The excited and expecting people were flocking to them. Peter had just professed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But a shift was about to take place. The Jesus message had changed. The followers saw things differently. Some were convinced that everything was okay with them. Others wanted more of the good times, and there were some who came with conditions. Their message to the Lord was disturbing. "We want more. We want to see more. We want you, O Lord, all for ourselves." Peter's reaction reflected men's thinking, not God's thoughts. What was Jesus teaching Peter and the followers? It was about three realities that would confront all genuine followers of Christ. The first is the reality of Satan that Jesus had already encountered in the wilderness, which was now being manifested in Simon Peter. It points to anyone or anything that attempts to subvert or hijack the plans and works of God. It is the temptation to exchange the will of God for the pleasantries offered to us. The second is the reality of glamour and gloom that the followers had to handle. There was always an inner struggle with the light and darkness, to subscribing to God's ways or their own way, to having the mind of Christ or to think like men. The third is the reality of the hard way versus the easy way that demanded renunciation and detachment. It was painful to deny oneself, take up the cross and follow Him. There was a price to pay and a sacrifice expected. But what do we see in our churches and our followers? A wide gap. A wide gap between the talkers and the doers, the hearers of the word and the keepers of the word. One, we encounter two sets of followers, those who think like God and those who think like men. Paul reminded the Romans to put on the mind of Christ. Two, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian, identified that there were Christians who sought cheap grace, contrasted to those who lived for costly grace. Many of us are like Peter, tempted to cheap grace. How do we recognize the chase after cheap grace? Bonhoeffer listed down the following: preaching forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without Christian discipline, communion without confession, and absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, and grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. 3. Jeremiah tried to live God's will by bravely facing confrontation and persecution. For Paul, doing God's will meant not conforming to contemporary cultures. And Jesus discerned the will of God from the human ways and diversions. What is the quality of our following? Are we total, conditional, or selective as followers, ministers, or missionaries? Think like God Discard the ways of man. Be ready to shoulder your cross. Of course, the other road that awaits us is the disciples' way of cheap grace.